Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, and with me is Sam. Today we're asking the annoying little travel question behind airline baggage fees. If the bag is the thing you pay for, why does the cheap fare feel like the bait and the real price show up later?
Because that is exactly what makes it so awkward. The rules say airlines have to disclose baggage fees on a homepage link and on the first screen with a fare quote. So the information is there, but it is still easy to miss while you're hunting for the lowest number.
Right, so this is not just read the fine print harder. It's about how the shopping flow works. Let's start with the basic trick. The starting take on why baggage fees make the sticker price look better than the trip really is. Sam, start us off.
Okay, but the main thing here is the fare on the screen is only part of the price. The airline knows most people are not shopping for a philosophical idea of travel. They're shopping for the number that gets them to click.
And that's where the irritation starts. Because the bag is usually not the weird part. The weird part is that the cheapest looking number gets the spotlight, and everything you actually need to take the trip shows up later like it's doing you a favor.
That's what makes it feel scammy. Not necessarily illegal, not necessarily hidden in some cartoon villain way, but the structure is doing a lot of work before you ever get to the real cost. You get the fare, then maybe the seat, then maybe the boarding priority, then the bag, and suddenly the cheap ticket has grown fangs.
I'd separate the emotional reaction from the accusation. Annoying is easy to prove. Misleading is a little harder. Fraud is a different animal entirely. But the core suspicion, the fair version of it, is that the airline is presenting the trip in a way that makes the base fare look more competitive than the real total would look if everything were bundled up front.
Joe, am I overstating that if I say the airline is basically selling the headline and hoping you do the math later? Because that feels like the whole trick. The first number is friendly, and the second number is where the trip gets honest.
That's the cleaner version, yeah. I would not call every low base fare deceptive just because the rest of the price exists. But if the design nudges people to compare the wrong number, that's a real problem. It is the difference between saying, here's what this costs, and saying, here's the part you wanted to notice first.
Right, and nobody shops like a saint with a clipboard. People compare whatever is loudest on the screen because that's how the market trains them. So if the airline knows a normal traveler probably needs a bag, the cheaper looking fare isn't just informing you, it's steering you toward a decision before the full bill is in view.
That's the sharper criticism. Not they invented a fee, because they didn't invent the reality that bags cost something to move around. It's more like the brochure version of the trip gets the spotlight, and the receipt version arrives later. That doesn't prove evil intent, but it does tell you where the pressure is coming from.
And the customer usually finds that out while already annoyed, already late, already trying to remember whether the suitcase counts as a personal item or a second mortgage. That's why this lands harder than a random fee at a coffee shop. The fee is attached to something people actually expect to need, not some optional add-on you can ignore if you're not in the mood.
That's the pressure point. If the add-on is for something optional, people shrug more easily. If it's for a pretty normal part of traveling, the airline isn't just charging extra. It's making the trip look cheaper than it usually will be for a normal person. Those are different complaints, and the second one is the one worth testing.
So the question isn't just, do baggage fees exist? Of course they exist. The question is whether the cheap fare is being used as a lure, and then the real price gets unpacked later when you've already mentally said yes. That's the part that feels designed, not accidental.
Exactly. And if that's what's happening, the business model may still be legal, and still leave people feeling played. The next thing to figure out is why that feeling is so widespread, and whether it's because airlines are uniquely slippery or because the whole shopping setup rewards a low sticker price over an honest total.
Okay, so the reason people get annoyed is pretty simple. The advertised fare gets all the attention, and then the trip turns out to need extra pieces that cost more. Bag, seat, boarding priority, maybe just the ability to travel like a normal person. That is why it feels cheap, only until you try to actually use it.
That is the part people are reacting to. They are not imagining the fee. They are reacting to the gap between the number that looks like the price and the number that feels like the price.
And the gap is what makes it feel shady, even when the fee is not hidden. You can be told somewhere on the page, technically, and still come away feeling like the airline was counting on you not noticing until you were already halfway committed.
Not even counting on, more like relying on the fact that people shop by the headline number first.
Yeah, and once you notice that pattern, the whole checkout path feels annoying. Click through the fare, compare the bag rule, check the seat map, figure out whether the cheap ticket is cheap for you or only cheap for the person traveling with one backpack and a charger.
And that's why families and group travelers feel it harder. If you're traveling with kids or you actually need luggage, the fee does not feel optional. It feels like the price of the trip got split into pieces that only make sense after you already started comparing fares.
So what part of that is the actual irritation, Joe? Is it the fee itself or the fact that the cheapest fare is built for the least complicated traveler in the world?
Mostly the second one. A bare bones fare is not automatically unfair, but it creates a comparison problem. The airline gets to lead with the number that looks best, while the stuff most people actually need shows up later in the process.
Right, and people do not buy airfare in the abstract. They buy a trip. If you know you're going to need a bag or a seat assignment, it can feel like the airline is advertising one price and selling the usable version somewhere else.
That feeling is understandable. What makes it messy is that shady can mean a few different things. Badly structured, easy to miss, or genuinely misleading. Those are not the same claim, even if they land in the same stomach.
Sure, but the structure still nudges people toward the wrong comparison. You look at the headline fare, you think you found the cheap option, and only later do you realize the real total is different. That is enough to make people feel like the game is tilted.
Exactly. Once you have mentally filed it under cheap, every extra charge feels heavier than it would have at the start, even when the math is not doing anything mystical. That is why the anger is real, even when the legal question is weaker than the emotional one.
And the weirdest part is that the fee can be small and still feel bigger than it is. It is not the amount alone. It is that it shows up after your brain has already decided the ticket was cheap.
That is the fair version of the complaint. Not that every baggage fee is some grand scam, but that the offer starts to feel honest only when the price people actually end up paying is the one doing the work. So the next question is where the line belongs between the fare and the add-on.
Okay, so let's stop acting like the fee itself is the mystery. The actual issue is that the base fare gets presented like it is the whole price, when the real trip often includes the fare plus the stuff most people need just to travel normally. Bags, seat choice, boarding priority. The airline has chopped the thing into pieces, and now you're supposed to admire the first piece like it's the whole meal.
That's the clean distinction. Base fare is the ticket to be on the plane. Add-ons are the pieces the airline prices separately. That can be perfectly legitimate and still feel hostile if the thing you actually need gets framed like some optional bonus instead of part of the trip people are trying to buy.
And that is why people get suspicious. The cheap fare gets your attention first, then the rest of the price shows up later, after you've already started comparing flights in your head. So the shopper thinks they're comparing two prices, but they're often comparing two different setups that are pretending to be the same kind of thing.
Right, and comparison is the whole game here. If one airline puts more into the fare and another peels it off into separate charges, the shopper has to translate that before the numbers mean anything. The airline with the lower sticker price wins the first glance, even if the real cost is higher once you add the necessary extras.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the problem isn't that the fee exists, it's that the customer is doing the airline's arithmetic for them? Because that's what it feels like. You get one clean number up front, then you have to mentally rebuild the real price piece by piece. And that is a weird way to make people shop.
That's the better version of the complaint. The issue is not there is an extra charge, because lots of businesses charge extra for extra things. It's whether the pricing is clear in a way a normal person can compare quickly before they're halfway committed and trying not to start over.
And clear is doing a lot of work there. Technically disclosed means the information exists somewhere, in the fee table, on another page, or in the little box everyone scrolls past because they're trying to get the booking done before the price shifts again. So yes, the detail may be there. The question is whether anyone can actually use it without slowing the whole decision to a crawl.
That's the split people keep flattening. Technically disclosed means the airline can point to the place where the rule lives. Meaningfully transparent means the shopper can tell up front what they're really paying and how it stacks up against the other option, without doing detective work or remembering 6 different add-ons in their head.
So the fair complaint is not all add-ons are evil. It's that some charges are basically unavoidable for a normal trip. And when those are separated out, the low fare stops being a useful comparison point. It becomes the number that gets your attention first, not the number that helps you decide.
Yeah, and once different airlines package the same trip differently, the shopper has to do extra work just to line them up. One airline can look cheaper because it strips the presentation down, while another looks expensive because it keeps more of the cost visible. That's not automatically deceptive, but it does change who gets rewarded for making the price easy to read.
And that's the part that bugs people. The cheapest looking option is only cheapest if you happen to fit the airline's preferred shape of traveler. If you need a bag, or you want to sit where you booked, or you don't want the whole experience to feel stripped down, the advertised fare is doing a lot less work than it claims to do.
Mostly, yeah. That's why the real argument here isn't did they mention it somewhere, it's did they make the price legible in a way people can actually compare before choosing. Because if disclosure is technically present but practically hard to use, the company can still hide behind the phrase, "it was disclosed," and act like that settles everything.
Exactly. So the next lazy defense is going to be, well, it was disclosed. Sure, but disclosed where, in what shape, and compared to what? If the answer is basically somewhere in there if you knew to look, that's not the same thing as making the price feel honest. Okay, but let's separate the lazy answer from the real one. The lazy answer is just read the fine print or compare better, which is basically consumer blame with a suit on, except the suit is pretending to be advice. It sounds responsible because it puts the burden on the buyer, but it skips over how the airline arranged what people notice first.
That's the better way to frame it. There is some consumer responsibility here, but somewhere on the page and built into the way people shop are not the same thing.
Right, because the bad first answer is basically the fee was disclosed. So if you got surprised, that's on.
That's too neat. In the US, airlines and ticket agents have to advertise the full ticket price upfront, taxes and carrier-imposed charges included. So this is not a simple, they forgot to mention the total story. The disclosure rules exist. The complaint is that disclosure on paper doesn't automatically make shopping feel fair.
And that's where the smug version gets cheap. Yes, the information can be technically available, but the first number people see is still the one doing the selling, and the rest of the fees have to fight for attention after the customer is already leaning toward the booking.
Exactly. DOT even says baggage fee info needs a clear homepage link and a link on the first screen with a fare quote for a specific itinerary, which is a pretty good clue that somewhere on the site is not the same as prominent enough to shape the decision.
So the official fix is basically move it earlier, which tells you the problem is not imaginary. Joe, am I overstating it if I say the cheap fare is being used as the lure and the add-ons are doing the real work?
No, that's a fair suspicion, as long as you keep it in the lane of design and incentives, not mind reading. The fair version is that buyers should notice the total before they commit. The unfair version is pretending the airline's pricing structure doesn't steer attention toward the headline fare first.
And comparison shopping gets messy fast because one airline can look cheaper until you start mentally assembling the real price from the bag, the seat, and the stuff you basically need to take the trip. That's not the same as saying customers are helpless. It's just saying the checkout path is doing some of the persuasion for them.
Right, and that matters because people are not sitting there with a spreadsheet and a sense of civic duty. Once you've picked a flight, you're no longer reading like a stranger. You're trying to justify the flight you already like, and the design knows that.
And that is the annoying part. The system doesn't need to hide the fee to be manipulative. It just needs to make the cheap fare feel like the real offer, and the extra stuff feel like a nuisance after the emotional decision is already made.
And that's why the 2024 ancillary fee rule matters. It says airlines and ticket agents have to tell consumers before purchase what they charge for a first or second checked bag, a carry-on bag, and reservation changes or cancellations, because regulators still saw the risk of unexpected fees that can add up fast to what first looked like the cheaper ticket.
So the bad answer is too tidy. People should have read it. End of story. That's not a serious standard if the whole system is built so the cheap number gets the spotlight and the unavoidable extras show up late enough to feel like a second purchase.
Which is why the next question is, who benefits from that order? And how much of this is a sales tactic instead of just sloppy communication?
Okay, but before we keep calling it annoying, let's look at how this thing actually gets presented. The weird part is that the system isn't usually hiding in a secret drawer somewhere. It's sitting right there in the booking flow, just not where your brain wants to look first.
That's the useful distinction. In the US, DOT says airlines and ticket agents have to disclose baggage, change, and cancellation fees before purchase, when fare and schedule information is shown for flights to, within, and from the United States. So this isn't a pure surprise at the airport setup. It's more like, the information exists, but the shopping experience makes you work for it.
Right, and the little detail that matters is the placement. DOT also says baggage fee information has to show up through a homepage link and on the first screen with a fare quotation for a specific itinerary. That's not nothing, but it still leaves a lot of room for the human brain to go, cool, I saw the cheap fare, we'll deal with the rest later.
Exactly. Disclosure can be real and still be easy to overlook or mentally discount. If the first number people see is the base fare, that number does a lot of psychological work before the add-ons ever get a fair shot at your attention.
Which is the whole trick, honestly. Not necessarily a fake trick, just a very human one. You see the price you want to see, and then the bag, the seat, the boarding priority, the thing you actually need to travel like a normal person, all show up as separate choices that are somehow not really choices.
Yeah, and I'd be careful with not really choices. They are choices in the narrow sense. The problem is that for a lot of travelers, some add-ons are close to unavoidable if they want a normal trip. So the business model can stay technically transparent while still making the headline fare a little misleading in practice.
That's the part people get mad about. The fare looks like the product, but it's really more like the starting point. By the time you're done, you're comparing one airline's cheap-looking quote with another airline's cheap-looking quote. And the baggage reality can be totally different because baggage rules are airline-specific.
That airline-specific piece matters a lot. It means the same good deal can mean different things depending on whose rules you're playing under. So even before we get to the fee itself, comparison shopping gets messy in a way that favors the carrier that can make its first number look best.
And that's where the whole modern system feels different from the old one. DOT has said many airlines now charge separately for bags where bags had historically been included in airfare, which is a pretty big shift in how the product is framed. It went from, here's your trip, to, here's your trip, then please assemble the rest of it.
That historical shift is the receipt, really. Unbundling became normal. And once it becomes normal, it starts to feel like common sense instead of a pricing choice. Then everybody adapts. Airlines, ticket sites, consumers. And the base fare becomes a kind of decoy headline, even when the disclosures are technically there.
Decoy headline is exactly the phrase. Not because anyone taped a fake sign to the wall, but because the part that gets your attention first is not the part that tells you what you'll actually pay. That's why people walk away feeling a little played, even when the fine print was sitting in front of them.
And to be fair, regulators seem to have noticed that problem too. DOT's 2024 rule was basically a response to that broader competition push, with the idea being that consumers should have the information they need to understand the true cost of air travel. So the government's not saying no one disclosed anything, it's saying apparently disclosure alone still wasn't enough.
Which is a nice, polite way of saying people were still missing the real number. So, Joe, am I overstating it if I say the industry's genius is not the fee itself, but getting you emotionally committed to the cheap fare before your brain has done the math?
No, that's pretty fair. I'd just tighten it one step. The genius is making the first number easiest to compare, while the real-world total takes more effort to assemble. That's not automatically fraud, but it is a design choice that benefits the seller and makes the buyer do the homework late.
So the honest standard isn't never charge for bags. It's don't pretend the base fare is the whole story. And don't make people discover the real trip price after they've already invested attention in the wrong number. Okay, now that the mechanics are clearer, follow the money and the attention. Who actually likes this setup?
Airlines like it because the first number gets all the customer attention, and the extra charges do real work after that. IATA says ancillary services are now nearly 14% of total airline revenue, up from roughly 12 to 13% before the pandemic. So this is not some tiny side hustle.
So the pretty part of the fare is doing the marketing, and the rest of the price shows up later with a carry-on, a checked bag, a seat you actually want, all the stuff a normal trip tends to need.
And the DOT was pointing at the same basic problem years ago. People often could not tell the full cost of their own travel, ticket plus extras, before they bought it. That matters because competition rewards the lowest looking fare, even when the airline knows the real money may come from the add-ons and
The people who can't travel like monks.
Exactly. Those are the customers who get pinched. If you can pack light, sit anywhere, and never check a bag, the low headline fare can feel like you beat the system. But if you need baggage, seat choice, or just a little flexibility because real life exists, the model shifts more of the bill onto you.
So the airline gets to make the base price look friendly, while the people who actually need the extras absorb the cost. That's the part that makes it feel sneaky without necessarily being hidden.
Right, and that distinction matters. This can be annoying, and it can be designed to confuse without automatically crossing into fraud or illegality. The cleaner complaint is that the comparison shoppers make is incomplete. One airline may bake more into the base fare, another strips it down and wins the eyeball contest, even if the trip ends up costing more for a lot of people.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the unfair part is less the fee itself and more that the airline wants the first price to do sales work for the real one?
That's the cleaner version. A bag fee can be disclosed and still be a bad comparison tool if the traveler has to assemble the real price in their head after the fact. And competition keeps the pressure on. If one carrier makes the whole trip price obvious, and another keeps the base fare stripped down, the stripped down number often looks better before anyone has done the annoying arithmetic.
So it can look customer friendly on the surface while still pulling more revenue from the passengers most likely to need the extras. That is exactly why people feel played, even when the fee is disclosed somewhere in the small print maze.
And that's the honest complaint. Not that every fee is hidden, but that the architecture makes the true price harder to feel before commitment. If you wanted a fairer version, you'd show the normal trip total up front, bag, seat, and other must-haves, so people are comparing the real trip, not the teaser fare. Then the airline can still compete, but it has to compete on the price people actually pay.
Okay, so the polite answer is the fees are disclosed, people can choose a different airline, and if you want the bag or the seat or the priority boarding, you pay for it. That's the clean corporate version, and it's not totally fake. The annoying part is that it stops right before the part people actually feel. Most travelers are not shopping for some abstract ticket, only experience. They're shopping for the trip they'll actually have, and the price they notice first is the one that wins the click.
That's the fair version of the defense, yeah. It's not that the fee is invisible, and it's not that every passenger is being tricked into buying something they never agreed to. The stronger criticism is narrower. The pricing is doing marketing work before it does disclosure work. The headline fare gets attention, and then the stuff people reliably need shows up later, when they're already mentally committed to the trip.
And that's the part people keep trying to talk around. They act like disclosure on page 3 cancels out the fact that page 1 is basically yelling, "Look how cheap this is." Sure, technically there's a box somewhere, but the box is not the experience. The experience is you start comparing flights, the low fare grabs you, and then you discover the real comparison depends on whether you need a bag, want a seat, or don't enjoy being treated like a piece of carry-on luggage that learned to complain.
Right, and that's where the honest argument gets better. The issue isn't they said nothing. The issue is that disclosure and comprehension are not the same thing. A company can technically tell you the price components and still design the offer so the cheapest number gets the emotional lead. People don't compare every fare with a spreadsheet in their lap. They compare the visible number first, and the visible number is doing the heavy lifting.
So the real answer is not they lied. It's more like the whole structure is built to win the first look and sort out the rest later. That's not a legal conclusion, and I don't need it to be. It just means the business model benefits from people reacting to the wrong number at the wrong time. Who pays for that? The customer who has to do extra mental work, and usually the customer who's under the most pressure to book fast.
Yeah, and that's the part that keeps this from being lazy, anti-company whining. There's a real difference between annoying, misleading, manipulative, and illegal. You can land squarely in annoying and manipulative without crossing into fraud. The sharper complaint is that the design asks people to make the cheapest comparison first, then rewards them for discovering later that the actual trip costs more. That's not a tiny footnote. That's the whole trick of the presentation.
Am I overstating it if I say the consumer is still choosing, just under a pretty bad spotlight? Because I think that's the most honest version. Nobody's forced to book. Nobody's dragged into the payment screen at gunpoint. But choice can be real and still be nudged. If you make the cheap number loud and the unavoidable extras quieter, you're shaping the decision before the person thinks they're deciding.
I think that's the useful distinction. Choice is real, but the environment is doing work on the choice before the shopper fully notices it. And airlines know exactly why that matters. If two fares look similar at the first glance, people don't do a full accounting of bags, seats, and boarding priority unless they're unusually patient or unusually annoyed. Most people just want the number that looks survivable. That's why the low headline fare matters so much.
So if we wanted a fair version, it would have to make the real comparison obvious early, not buried under 5 little add-ons and a hope that nobody notices until the end. You could still charge for extras. I'm not arguing everybody should get a magical, everything-included ticket. I'm saying the design should help people compare the trip they're actually buying, not the fantasy version where nobody brings a suitcase and nobody wants to sit together.
That's the standard I'd keep. Disclosure that's legible at the moment of comparison, not just technically present somewhere in the process. If the business model depends on customers understanding the price only after they've already fallen in love with the cheap number, then the polite defense gets thinner fast. And the next question is why so many people still defend that as straightforward, when it's really just a very tidy way to muddle the conversation.
Okay, let's clean up the dumb version of this before it gets us into trouble. The bad take is airlines are secretly charging you extra and nobody told you, and that is too sloppy to be useful. The real complaint is meaner and better than that.
Right. The sharper version is that the fee can be disclosed and still not be clear in the moment that matters, which is when you're comparing flights and trying to figure out the real cost. So the fight is not just about whether the number exists somewhere on the site.
People keep acting like once the fee lives somewhere on the website, the buyer has been fully informed and can just sort it out like it's a tax form. But people are not shopping like that. They're tired, they're moving fast, and they're usually comparing the first fare that looks like a bargain.
That word is doing way too much work. DOT has basically said the quiet part out loud. Consumers are not always able to determine the cost of their own travel, including the ticket price plus optional service fees, before they buy. So the issue is not just whether the fee exists in some technical sense. It's whether the shopping experience actually lets people understand what they're choosing.
And some people absolutely do know what they're doing, which is why this is not a total victim story. Frequent flyers, business travelers, people who've been burned once already, they build the baggage fee into the math. But a lot of buyers are still reacting to the cheapest looking number first, not the full trip cost.
So are you saying the hidden part is really the comparison part, not the fee itself? Because that's a different accusation, and it's a stronger one.
Yeah, exactly. It's not you can never find the fee. It's The fee is not front and center when people are deciding. So the cheapest looking ticket gets credit it hasn't earned yet. That is a real distortion, even if the disclosure is technically there.
And that's why disclosure alone doesn't equal clarity. DOT's rules push the total ticket price to be more prominent than the breakdown of charges, and optional services only get added if the consumer affirmatively agrees. They also require baggage fee information to show up on a homepage link and on the first screen with a fare quotation for a specific itinerary, which is a pretty strong sign the real fight is the shopping interface, not some buried policy page.
So the honest version is not they hid everything forever. It's they made the thing you actually have to pay attention to easy to miss, and then acted like putting it on a page solves the problem. That is different from fraud, but it still feels engineered to exploit how people shop.
That's the useful distinction. The 2024 DOT rule was framed around surprise fees that can add significant cost to what first looks like a less expensive ticket. And that's the point people keep flattening when they say, well, the fee was disclosed, so what's the problem?
Because the cheap-looking fare gets the emotional vote first. The bag fee shows up later, after your brain has already anchored on the lower number. And by then, you're not comparing two clean options anymore. You're trying to salvage the decision you already liked.
Yeah, and that doesn't require a cartoon villain or some elaborate scheme. It just requires a purchase flow that lets the first number do the marketing and the second number do the correction. That's enough to make the cheap option feel cheaper than it really is.
Where would you draw the line then? What would count as fair enough that we stop calling it misleading and just call it annoying?
I think the line is whether the traveler can see the likely total without doing homework. Not perfect certainty, just enough visibility that a normal person can compare options without feeling like the airline is making them play detective. If the bag charge is common enough that it changes the real price for a lot of people, then it should be hard to miss at the moment of choice.
That's the part people skip. They either jump straight to, it's a scam, or retreat to, it was disclosed, end of story. And both versions miss the actual complaint. The stronger criticism is that the system counts on enough people comparing the wrong number to keep the headline fare looking clean.
And once you say it that way, you can see why some of the blame lands on consumers too. Not because they're stupid, but because they reward the lowest headline price, even when they know there's baggage, seats, or other add-ons waiting to show up later. That does not erase the airline's role. It just means the system survives on both the design and the response to it.
Okay, but now we have to be honest about the embarrassing part. A lot of us keep feeding this thing. We spend 10 minutes being mad about baggage fees, then we sort by the lowest visible fare and act like the rest will magically sort itself out later.
Some of it will sort itself out later, though. That's the point. People aren't stupid. They're doing the version of shopping that fits the budget they have right now, which is usually the only budget that matters.
Right, and that's why this part is annoying to admit. The airline puts the clean number in front of you. The extra costs are sitting off to the side, and your brain goes, we'll deal with that when we get there, because the first number is doing all the persuasion work.
And once you've clicked, you're already invested. That's when the bag fee, the seat fee, the boarding nonsense, whatever it is, stops feeling optional in a practical sense, even if it was technically disclosed somewhere before you bought it.
That's the embarrassing consumer move. We know there's a second layer to the price, but we still reward the lowest base fare because it feels like winning at checkout. Then we act surprised when the bill is not the neat little number we wanted to believe in.
Is that really the right criticism, though? Because if two flights are otherwise similar, of course people look at the lower sticker price first. I don't want to turn ordinary price shopping into some kind of character flaw.
No, that's fair, and that's the line worth keeping. If somebody's budget is tight, they are not being irrational or immoral by chasing the cheaper fare. Sometimes that's the difference between taking the trip and not taking it at all.
Exactly. And that's why the cleaner version is not consumers are bad. It's that the system trains everyone to compare on the easiest number first and then expects people to absorb the rest when they're already committed.
Yeah, and once the add-ons become predictable, they stop being a surprise in the strict sense. They become part of the real price, but one we keep pretending is separate because the airline got us with the headline fare first.
That's the pressure point. The airline benefits from the low advertised number because it gets attention and converts shoppers. And the passenger benefits in the moment because the fare looks manageable. The confusion is not an accident of one side being dumb. It's built into how the comparison works.
And to be fair, the customer side isn't fake here either. A lot of people really do have to choose the cheapest looking option and hope they can make the rest fit because their money is doing the limiting before the airline ever gets a say.
That's the part that keeps this from becoming a smug lecture. It's not that everyone is making a perfectly informed, rational choice and then somehow acting confused for fun. It's that the market pushes people toward short-term survival math. And short-term survival math is very good at rewarding the lowest visible number.
So the self-critique is useful, but only if it stays honest. We do help sustain the model when we keep voting for the cheapest headline fare and mentally postponing the rest. But that doesn't absolve the airlines because they're the ones designing the offer, so the real price is harder to feel at the start.
And that's the stronger version of the argument. Consumers aren't innocent, but they're also not running the show. They respond to the price structure they're handed. If you want better behavior from buyers, you usually have to make the choice easier to understand before they commit, not after.
So the fair criticism is not, why are people stupid? It's, why do we keep letting the first number dominate when we know the real number is bigger? And if we want this to feel less broken, the next question is, what would make the offer clearer up front instead of easier to misread? Okay, so if we stop just hating the feeling of it, what would actually make this less annoying? Because the honest fix is not airlines become nice all of a sudden. It's making the real price show up earlier, before people are already halfway committed and mad about it.
That's the clean version. You don't have to abolish every fee. You have to make comparison shopping less stupid. The problem isn't just that charges exist. It's that the customer has to discover the full shape of the trip after they've already started shopping.
So am I overstating it if I say the first fix is basically all-in pricing on the booking page? Put the fare, the bag cost, and the seat stuff in front of people before they click through and start doing math they did not agree to do.
Before they're already invested. Yeah. And that isn't some fantasy standard. There's already a baseline version of it. The current U.S. rule requires airlines and ticket agents to tell consumers upfront what they charge for baggage, changes, and cancellations before purchase. And DOT says baggage fee information has to be easy to find from the homepage and on the first screen with a fair quotation.
Right, so the principle exists. The annoying part is that available somewhere and right there in the decision are not the same thing. Most people are not opening 5 tabs and comparing carrier policy PDFs like they're doing taxes for fun.
Exactly. There's a difference between disclosure and usable disclosure. If the fee is technically findable, but psychologically hidden, you still force people to do the work. That's why the design question matters just as much as the legal one.
And that's the part that feels sneaky without necessarily being illegal. You can tell me the information exists, but if I have to click around to find it, the system is asking me to work for the privilege of paying you.
That's a fair complaint, as long as we keep the categories straight. It can be annoying, it can be misleading in practice, and it can be designed to nudge people toward the cheapest looking fare. But that's not the same thing as proving fraud or some secret plan. The fix is to reduce the hidden work part. Not pretend every extra charge disappears if we just glare at the airline hard enough.
So what would you actually want on the screen? Because I'm thinking a normal person should see the fare, the bag price, and the real trip total in one place. Not the fantasy version where nobody brings luggage and nobody needs a seat assignment.
That's the standard I'd like too. And if you want to go one step further, put the baggage fee beside the fare, not buried 3 clicks away. One glance should tell you, this is the ticket price, this is the bag price, this is what you actually pay. That doesn't solve airline economics, but it does solve a lot of confusion.
And maybe the bigger win is just making comparison less painful. If one airline shows the total one way, another shows it another way, and a third makes you hunt for the bag charge like it's hidden state secrets, people aren't really comparing offers anymore. They're comparing interfaces.
Yeah, that's the part people skip. A fix doesn't have to be perfect to be useful. It just has to make the real trade-off visible early. Bundles can help too, but only if they're simple and consistent. 1 or 2 obvious package choices is useful. 6 different names that all mean maybe you'll pay less, maybe you'll pay later, just moves the confusion around.
Do you think bundles are actually a good thing then, or are they just a nicer looking version of the same mess? Because I can live with pay for a bag. I just don't want the airline to hide that bag inside a naming convention.
They're useful when they reduce the number of decisions and the number of surprises. They're bad when they become branding theater. A bundle should answer the obvious questions fast. Does it include a bag? Does it include a seat? What is the total? And what happens if I skip it? If it doesn't do that, it's not simplification. It's just a prettier layer over the same hassle.
So the fair version is not no fees. It's fees in the open at the point of decision in a format that normal humans can compare without a scavenger hunt. That feels like the minimum standard anyone should defend.
That's the standard. Clear totals, adjacent fee disclosure, and bundles only if they actually lower the work the customer has to do. If the design still makes people discover the real price after they've mentally bought the ticket, then the system is still leaning on confusion. And that's the part worth fixing.
Okay, so here's the clean version of the complaint. The fees are usually disclosed, but the airline still wants the sticker price to do the emotional heavy lifting. The bag charge, the seat charge, the boarding nonsense, all the stuff people actually need shows up later after the cheap fare has already won your attention. That's why it feels sneaky even when it isn't literally hidden.
That's the part that survives, yes. I wouldn't call that hidden in the strict sense if it's disclosed somewhere, but it is absolutely a presentation strategy. The airline benefits when people compare the visible fare first and only do the full math after they've already started imagining the trip is booked, because by then, the cheap number has done its job.
So the real complaint isn't, they never told me, it's, they told me in the least useful place possible. That's a worse kind of annoyance, honestly, because it lets the airline look clean while still steering you toward the wrong comparison. Joe, is that the fairest version of the gripe, or am I still making it sound too scammy?
That's the fairer version. I'd separate it into 3 buckets: disclosed, inconvenient, and deceptive. This lands in the first 2 most of the time, not automatically the third. But the structure can still be manipulative in the ordinary sense. Not some grand villain plot, just a system that reliably nudges people to underestimate the real cost until the purchase is emotionally in motion.
And the annoying part is that the people who travel light can look at that setup and say, what's the problem? Just don't buy the extras. Which is fair up to a point. But if you actually need the bag, the seat, or the ability to board without feeling like you're in a social experiment, then the advertised fare is only the first chapter of the price.
That's the key distinction. Unbundling isn't automatically dishonest, because some people genuinely do want the bare minimum and can compare those offers cleanly. The problem is that a lot of travelers don't experience the extras as optional in any practical sense. If you're comparing real trips instead of theoretical ones, the display should help you see the cost of the trip you actually mean to take.
Right, because nobody is planning a vacation around some fantasy where they travel with no bag, no seat assignment, and no friction. They need the stuff, and the airline knows they need the stuff. So the cheap fare isn't the whole offer. It's the thing that gets your eye before the airline starts charging you for normal human travel.
So let me ask it this way. If you were designing a fairer display, what would you put on the first screen? Because be more transparent is easy to say, but the real question is whether the airline should lead with the base fare, the likely total, or some kind of clear bundle that says, this is what most people actually pay.
I'd start with the number people are most likely to end up paying for the trip they think they're buying. Not some mystical all-in price for every possible human, but the honest version of the common trip. If the bag is common, if seat selection is common, if the trip basically assumes those things, put them close to the front instead of making people dig for them like they're decoding a bad menu.
That's the strongest fare version. It doesn't pretend every extra is mandatory, and it doesn't pretend the sticker fare is meaningless either. It just stops pretending the first number is the whole story. If the airline wants people to compare honestly, then the display has to make comparison easy before anybody is already halfway committed and trying to feel smart about a cheap fare.
And that's the whole thing, really. The weirdness is not one evil bag fee. It's a pricing story that makes the cheap number feel like the real price and everything else feel like a surprise nobody asked for. If you know that going in, you can stop arguing with the banner ad and start asking the one question that matters. What will this trip actually cost me?
That's the clean takeaway. Don't let the fare banner hypnotize you. Compare the total out-the-door cost for the trip you actually mean to take, because that's where the real price lives. The disclosure may be real, but the presentation still shapes the punch. And once you see that, the whole trick gets a lot less mysterious. That wraps up today's question. Thanks for listening to Say the Question. Follow the show so you don't miss tomorrow's episode.